I'd like to begin by welcoming everyone to this GDP stream workshop event. We've got people on Zoom and people at BCC. I'd like to begin also by acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands on which we meet today. For me, that's the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So my name is Umut Ozguc. I'm a senior lecturer here at Deakin. And we have three esteemed Deakin colleagues who are going to be speaking about new planetary perspectives on geopolitics. That's the theme of this workshop. We're going to proceed in chronological order by topic. And we're going to begin with Professor Miguel Vater, and we're going to be followed by, I don't quite know the chronology of Peter and Umut's talks, but let's just assume Umut. Dr. Umut Ozguc, and then Dr. Peter Ferguson. So thank you very much to the panelists. Over to you, Miguel.
Great. Thanks, Jim. So I'm just going to read my text. Should be about 10 minutes. So from Aristotle to Arendt, we have been accustomed to contrast the political to the private dimension of the oikos or household. However, at least since the Apollo missions photographed our blue planet, we have also gained a sense of this planet as, quote, a home for human beings during their life on Earth, end quote. That's from Arendt. The idea of home as configuring a sphere within which we can control atmospheric factors and protect ourselves from a threatening exterior is also applied to the planet on the Gaia hypothesis, which understands the Earth system, roughly speaking, as a homeostatic system that maintains the planet in a habitable state. Now, Aristotle conceived of the human being as a political animal in the sense that its destiny was played out in the polis, where values like equality, freedom, and justice are uppermost. But Dipesh, Chakrabarty, among others, have pointed out that in the Anthropocene and with climate change, a second concept of the human has been introduced: the human as a geological agent, as an impersonal and unconscious geophysical force, the consequence of collective human activity, end quote. According to Chakrabarty, this geological conception of the human species calls upon us to understand political action as that which helps humans to be at home on Earth beyond the time of the living, end quote. Here, clearly, the concept of home is no longer the same idea of home as oikos, against which Arendt famously opposes the public space. At stake, I think, in this new idea of politics is recovering the whole Earth as a home for a planetary conception of politics. Politics is assigned an internal relation to Earth as home. And this is the idea that I would like to explore only briefly in what follows. I guess my first point is that already in the wake of September 11, there were signals that a semantic shift was underway in relation to the idea of home. Thus, new governmental institutions were created to provide for, quote unquote, homeland security, where the concept of homeland erases any clear distinction between what is domestic, what is public, and what belongs to foreign relations. With the pandemic, we then got a global use of extended, quote unquote, home lockdowns under emergency powers. Now, the sociologist Bruno Latour has contended that if the human species is to save itself, it should start accepting the idea that it is permanently locked down within Gaia's critical zone without possibility of escape. These views illustrate what I mean by a planetary turn, the idea that the coming understanding of politics must take into account that the Earth is both our home and that the planet's habitability for human beings should no longer be taken for granted. Now, interestingly, Carl Schmitt, who introduced the concept of the political, was also instrumental in freeing the household from its secondary role in relation to the city. In his work on the law of the earth, or the nomos of the earth, and in his geopolitical distinction between land and sea, which I will discuss in a second, Schmitt pointed out that, quote, the house remains the nucleus and center of terrestrial life, together with its concrete orders, house and property, matrimony, family, and inheritance. The fundamental institution of law, namely dominium or property, receives its name from domus, which is the Latin for home. In his lectures on Gaia and the new climate regime, Bruno Latour has taken up Schmitt's flame, calling for a new political theology that would organize the emerging people of Gaia around the idea of a most just Earth. Now, for Chakrabarty, Schmidt's revaluation of the Earth-home relation as the ground of all possible international law remains within a globalized conception of the planet that emerged in the age of Western colonialism and imperialism. Conversely, Latour's new climate regime pretends to draw out a new law of the Earth as conceived, roughly speaking, along the lines of the new Earth system science. That said, I think Schmidt's thinking of the ways in which a planetary outlook affects our geopolitics might be the better starting point for our discussion today. In hindsight, a planetary turn within political theory was already underway during World War II. This is a period in which Schmidt began to question the Anglo-American vision of geopolitics that would lead to the post-war international order delineated by the Charter of the UN. Schmidt proposed back then the alternative idea of large spaces, Großraum, where hegemonic civilizations would have controlling power over nominally sovereign nations. As we now realize, these ideas were probably weaponized in Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and they certainly informed the infamous neo-imperial thinking of Dugin, whether he is or not Putin's ideologue. And Schmidt's geopolitical thought is definitely also being considered right now by regime intellectuals in China when thinking about Taiwan, Hong Kong, and South China Sea. Now, for Schmidt, geopolitics divided itself along the opposition between land and sea. This is an idea he took over from Halford Mackinder's 1999 book, Democratic Ideals and Reality, which posited a civilizational struggle between land-based powers, Russia, China, and quote-unquote world islanders, like the UK and the US, who had adopted an oceanic, quote-unquote, conception of freedom. For Mackinder, civilization always grows on the coastlines and is propelled by world islanders. Schmidt had a different idea. The point for him is that to both land and sea powers, there correspond entirely different systems of law and of the state, different laws of the earth. Whereas traditionally, empire had always presupposed a land-based territory and the sea was considered to be a hostile and uninhabitable space for the human species, things radically changed with the conquest of the Americas, which began what Schmidt calls, quote, a huge planetary space revolution that led to the modernity of the Renaissance. Now, while the Spanish and Portuguese kingdoms understood the Americas as a landmass upon which to extend their land-based empires, the English, according to Schmidt, took, quote unquote, a fateful decision to break away from the European continent and to view geopolitics from the perspective of the sea. England then became, quote, a ship or even a fish, the great whale, the Leviathan, whose true home would be the open seas. From this maritime perspective, Spain itself and the Spanish Empire appeared like one big whale that had stranded itself on the European landmass, unable to move and dying. That's a quote, by the way, from Edmund Burke, who saw Spain as the big stranded whale. In the end, according to Schmidt, the new English law of the earth prevailed over the Spanish one, mainly thanks to Queen Elizabeth's decision to employ so-called privateers, basically pirates working for the crown, who made it impossible for Spain and Portugal to bridge Europe to the Americas. That's a Pirate of the Caribbean, the Hollywood version of it. The sea-based law of the planet managed, according to Schmidt, to impose, quote, typically English methods of sea warfare as the universally recognized new rules of international law, end quote. From these methods, Schmidt concluded that England had in view an economic space of domination through which it could control or break up the trading of weaker sea powers. And the three defining characteristics of this decision to base political life on the sea over land are, according to him, quote, an unstate-like character of society, the predominance of indirect methods of rule, and what Schmidt calls the de-anchoring of the island, which is an interesting conception when applied to Australia, actually. Schmidt's analysis is obviously ideologically skewed. It was starting to develop during the war, the Second World War, and then it was designed to think against NATO in a certain sense, to give another option apart from NATO. That said, I think it contains a couple of important points, and with this I want to close. The first is that to the opposition between land and sea, there corresponds, according to Schmidt, an opposition between home as the basis of law and a ship as the basis of normative order. So we, as mentioned before, for Schmitt, the home remains the nucleus and center of terrestrial life. The home, it's based on a relationship to the earth that is mediated by taking, dividing, and cultivating land. The ship, for him, on the contrary, is a creation of technology and renders humans exclusively dependent on technology for their survival. Schmitt was convinced that the reason why the Industrial Revolution and global capitalism began in England was due to its national decision in favor of an existence at sea. This, he says, forced human beings to navigate a hostile and dangerous environment, which they could only master thanks to sustained technological innovation. And a second interesting point is that Schmitt argued that the contemporary imaginary of space travel simply extends the sea-based law into cosmic space to the point of seeing the Earth as a spaceship navigating in the vast ocean of the cosmos. But he was convinced that the Anglo-American epoch of sea-based law had come to an end actually in World War II, that we're living in a new period that we don't understand. He suggested, these were wartime writings, that during World War II, Nazi Germany tried but failed to oppose England's sovereignty over the oceans with a higher sovereignty over the skies. In short, it was Germany that opened up the new space age. And perhaps he was not entirely wrong. After all, the US and Russian space programs, we know, were only made possible because they offered refuge to German Nazi scientists like Werner von Braun that developed them. This suggests that control of the skies or the ether has the potential to become the basis of a new law of the Earth that would be radically distinct from the old sea-based and earth-based partitionings of the Earth. However, Schmitt never articulated this ether or air-based new law. And finally, my last point, and this is, I think, the most interesting for what we're trying to talk about here. For Schmitt, all politics and law ultimately have their condition of possibility in material elements and how human beings deal with them. Social orders change radically depending on whether one chooses to live politically on land or on the sea, on earth or water. But this raises the question, what kind of existence is conceivable if the choice is extended to the other two basic elements that were first identified by ancient Greek philosophy or science, namely air on the one hand and fire? How are these two other elements at play in the planetary turn that is linked with the Gaia hypothesis, and especially with climate change, which is clearly a narrative of heating up, right, the air around our planet? So what would be the law of the Earth that corresponds to these two elements? Okay, that was my.
Thanks a lot, Miguel. That was terrific. Should we go to Umut next and then Peter? Thanks, Umut.
Hi, everyone. What I want to talk about today is the contemporary debates on biopolitics and border studies and how these debates help us understand pandemic borders. Over the last few decades, the central question surrounding border politics has been how the traditional image of the territorial border has become irrelevant in the context of its increasingly mobile and network nature. The argument is that there has been a shift from geopolitics to biopolitics of borders. Borders no longer simply separate the territories of sovereign states. Rather, they're undergoing radical transformations. They're disintegrating, fragmenting, and moving away from their territorial locations. This has almost become like the slogan of critical border studies over the last 2 decades. Borders are everywhere. And it's argued that the emphasis on geopolitics is no longer a sufficient tool to understand border politics. Borders, instead, the argument goes, should be conceptualized as complex performances of state power staged at multiple locations through the technologies of detention, detection, selection, deterrence, expulsion, and preemption directed towards targeted groups. These diverse practices create a new border topology now referred to as networked border. Network border is a mobile, diffuse, flexible border that is constituted by the connection and collection of multiple sites, actors, and security technologies. The key dimension of this network border is biopolitics. Inspired by Foucault's reading of disciplinary and biopolitical power, many analyses now focus on the question of how this new border topology intervenes it and regulates the population it seeks to manage. The operation of this new border topology sustains itself by generating new disciplinary and biopolitical strategies and by improving and modifying already existing traditional apparatuses of border control. The diverse application of new border apparatuses like drones, virtual walls, and biometrics, and the improvement of traditional methods like concrete walls, fences, or passports. These techniques enable the formation of a new reality that transforms the border into a political technology whose object is not entirely stop movement, but to control, enable, and manage its circulation while capturing and taming its unpredictability. The biopolitical border is about risk management. As I wrote before, this biopolitical narrative locates the border at the heart of population management. In this narrative, the border operates as a connector, a complex network that brings together diverse elements of the social and political field in novel ways. It includes demographics, statistics, and surveillance techniques, as well as new actors such as private companies, civil military complex, and humanitarian agencies. In this Foucauldian language, borders are now best understood as a political technology, a security dispositive that produces power, knowledge of movement, of health and wealth in certain ways, and enables the production of population as a knowable and governable entity. Seen in these terms, the biopolitical nature of network borders transforms the mobile body into a site of observation, calculation, and risk assessment. And for the same, as you can see from these very well-known images, border as a security dispositive seeks to exclude risky bodies to create a safe space for those privileged ones. And of course, we should not understand biopolitical borders as a complete shift from geopolitics. It is not and has never been one or the other. Rather, geopolitics and biopolitics work together. They always need each other. And since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, biopolitics has become one of the key frameworks in our understanding of the current situation. And in fact, it's a useful one because public health has always been at the heart of biopolitics, and I would argue that there is nothing new about contemporary restrictions and policies. In my own work, I try to understand contemporary borders as a form of immunitary dispositive. I take the arguments of biopolitical borders a step further and argue that in the current context, biopolitical borders can be seen as immunitary dispositive for those who enjoyed all the privileges of liberal mobility regime before the pandemic. For Esposito, borders and immigration controls are solid expression of immunization paradigm of the modern state and its biopolitical existence. The term immunity refers to the resistance of an organism to the harmful effects of pathogens. Esposito shows us that in a political language, immunity denotes an attempt to protect the social body from the danger of communal interaction through the use of what it opposes. And for Esposito, national borders are constitutive elements of an immunity paradigm, which presupposes, but also negates community, a common life, an obligation of gift giving. Immunitas, therefore, is a negative protection of the self. He writes, and I quote, "It implies the exemption or exception from an obligation to care for others. The risk of contamination immediately liquidates contact, relationality, and being in common." Esposito suggests that within the framework immunization paradigm, and quote, "to become the object of political care, life had to be separated off and close up inside progressively desocialized spaces that were meant to immunize it against anything arising from community." In the current climate, I argue, closure of national borders in the last 2 years aim to protect and preserve life of those who become the object of political care while excluding those disposable bodies from any protection. And I would argue that in the context of the current pandemic, what we're witnessing is not new. Rather, what we've been witnessing since the beginning of the pandemic is the familiar biopolitics. Closure of borders or multiplication of borders aim to protect the future of mobility of those trusted bodies from the risk of contamination by refugees, asylum seekers, or unwanted immigrants. What we have been seeing is a form of racialized mobility, which is not new, rather is a central practice in biopolitics. So what happened, for example, in 2020 at Alfred Street public housing is not an isolated event. As you may all remember, on the 4th of July 2020, Alfred Street were placed into a lockdown without any warning. The place turned into a border zone, separating its residents, mostly from non-European and lower economic background, from the rest of the city. As Hagar Kotef argues in her critique of liberal governance of mobility, movement of some limits, hides, even denies the existence of others. The movement of some further maximized by this effacement of others and their need to move. And of course, the detention of these residents constituted a fundamental breach of their human rights. Yes, that's right. But racialized mobilities or mobility inequalities has always been at the heart of normalized biopolitical project of the modern state. And this project could turn into a form of necropolitics for some. As a final note, I'd like to mention that I do not feel comfortable with investing too much on this biopolitical picture or this negative biopolitical picture. Rather, I argue that borders are effective practices. Seeing borders as effective experiences offer us an alternative interpretation that can challenge the contemporary violent configuration of border politics. Effect signifies the transformational capacities of bodies in their encounters with one another in a Deleuzian sense. For Deleuze and Guattari, effect is the force behind all forms of social and political formations. It's a relational process. And we certainly do not know in advance whether these transformations will lead to a better future. But effective politics offers us hope, as Mercier suggests. In my reading, it indicates that the self-destructing reading of the immunity paradigm is not necessarily the only possibility. Effective politics is our capacity to change the former border between us and them. It indicates our capacity to become something other than what we are now. It is our transformational power to open ourselves to difference and to create a space for affirmative politics. And I don't know how affirmative politics could look like in the current context, or how it can be turned into a practice if the modern politics is all about biopolitics. I don't have an answer to that, but I believe it's an important question to consider. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Umut, and you leave us on a very provocative question. Peter, over to you for the final presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Sim. And Umut, had I known what your paper was going to cover, I might have brought a different paper over in a similar state of half-finishedness. I was going to look at the politics of stability and resilience within the Anthropocene through both a geopolitical notion of stability and a biopolitical notion of resilience, and more importantly, I think, to not mangle a Foucault quote, the way in which the biopolitics of resilience continues to circulate within the geopolitics of stability. That's a different paper for another time, I'm sorry. The paper I've got today is actually entitled Realpolitik in the Anthropocene, Stability, Resilience, and the Paris Agreement. And a couple of things motivated this paper, which I hope can attach partly to some of the themes that we've heard already. Probably the most important thing is a short article that appeared in Global Environmental Politics earlier this year, which is sort of the top journal in global environmental politics, from Nicholas Chan, who I think is at Monash in Malaysia. And he observed, without a lot of detail, but I think quite tellingly, that the Paris Agreement of 2015 and the ensuing climate regime, which has emerged from that, can be taken as an analogy which is being used in other areas of international regime building, primarily environmental regimes. So that there's talk of, a Paris agreement for plastics in the ocean, a Paris agreement for plastic for that agreement as an analogy. But I think it's also extending beyond simply global environmental politics. And he says this analogy is built around two things. There's an analogy of diplomatic success, where the analogy is used to highlight the desirability for achieving a similar level of political buy-in, both from nation states, but also from global community more broadly, and also as a model for institutional design, where the analogy is to the governance elements that are represented by the agreement. And it's this notion of institutional design that I want to pick up on now for a number of reasons. In the immediate post-Paris period, the institutional design elements which were driven by Obama and Kerry, were largely described in terms of attempts to Republican-proof the Paris Agreement. So the first thing was the way in which the mixture of binding and non-binding commitments was set out, with non-binding commitments for actual emissions reductions, only a binding commitment for the verification and reporting of those reductions, meant that Obama did not need to send the treaty to the US Senate in order to ratify. And of course, that wouldn't have ever got through because they can't even get a majority of Democrats, let alone a clear majority to vote for that. And secondly, and also quite importantly, some of the principles for withdrawal, which actually meant that Trump couldn't withdraw until the day after the 2020 election, which he lost, meant that basically the US was never out of Paris, despite the fact that Trump had indicated that he would. So that's sort of the initial explanation, but I want to dig a bit deeper, and I think the ensuing years have shown us something else, and that's actually that the institutional design elements here reflect, rather than the neoliberal institutionalist ideal of regime building, which is certainly informed and been used to explain most international regimes, and particularly environmental regimes, and especially the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement initially. I actually want to argue that realism gives us a much better understanding of why it's an institutional design analogy has been so strong. There's one obvious reason for that, and that is, despite there being not a lot of scholarship on this, it seems that a good number of policymakers, and particularly those in foreign affairs in the United States, probably would consider themselves or accept a large number of realist claims, and often behave or at least believe the rest of the world behaves like realists. The realists, of course, believe the liberals are in charge, and the liberals believe the realists are in charge. But realism speaks a language that these people understand. But more fundamentally, and this is the crux of my argument that I want to unpack in detail now, realism, and particularly neoclassical realism, actually has some epistemological and ontological connections with a notion of geopolitics in the Anthropocene, based around notions of systemic resilience rather than notions of system stability. Now, in a key recent work by Cameron Harrington, he argues that, and I'm just going to find the quote so I don't mangle it, that the Anthropocene ruptures the primary binaries upon which international relations has largely depended by breaking down the categorical barriers between human and non-human or natural realms, and allowing for messy forms of complexity and entanglement that comprise systems. So there's a shift here from seeing systems as something that should be stabilised and can be stabilised, to systems in which a more prudent approach is to seek only the resilience of those systems. And from a realist perspective, that resilience is, of course, about ensuring the resilience of your own nation state or grouping or alliance of states. And when resilience is defined broadly, and I'm very cautious here to give a definition of the concept of resilience, having written several papers about how much of a floating signifier the concept is, but a very broad definition of resilience is the capacity of an entity or system to withstand shocks, recover, adapt, or in some ways learn, evolve, or move to a new systemic equilibrium while maintaining basic functions, presents some significant challenges for what we call anthropocentric international relations theory, which can be contrasted with ecocentric or indeed post-human international relations theory. I don't have time to unpack that. This notion of moving from systemic equilibrium to systemic equilibrium, rather than maintaining stability defined in returning to some sort of level of pre-shock equilibrium, I think cast a very big challenge for anthropocentric IR theory. Neoliberal institutionalism, indeed, because the whole notion of building institutions is about creating stable expectations around which actors' interests can converge. But also, I'd argue for neo-realism, which, of course, is certainly built on notions of stability. So I want to work through these geopolitical notions of stability before unpacking some more, I guess, biopolitical notions of resilience, and arguing that it's really only neoclassical realism that can help us explain or reflect these new instabilities and changing system dynamics within the Anthropocene. Now, of course, realists have been traditionally pilloried by environmentalists for, at best, being uninterested in environmental problems. John Mearsheimer, of course, says has been an ardent realist critic of environmental concerns being treated as national security concerns, because he argues that environmental issues are only second-order issues and never first-order issues, and never part of third-image politics. But of course, the reality is that denying a realistic assessment of the state of the biosphere is, of course, you know, an unrealist way of looking at global politics. So green theorists, starting with Eckersley a couple of decades ago, have actually argued that it's pretty clear that it's not hard for states who are concerned primarily with their own powerful and survival to have an overriding interest in actually taking environmental issues, including climate change, seriously. So the green argument is that realists can very easily realign underlying state imperatives to be more environmentally conscious. And also, and importantly for the Paris Agreement, there's nothing in the notion of pursuing relative gains in the international system, which of course realists believe states do and must pursue. And what some of the sort of the realist explanations that are developing now, both normative and explanatory with respect to the Paris Agreement, and I guess the reason why I'm arguing that the Paris as an analogy is explained by its coherence with some forms of realist thought, is that actually the Paris Agreement does allow the pursuit of relative gains and environmental security win-wins. So countries which can reduce their dependence on foreign fossil fuel imports, obviously, as has been shown with Russia, and indeed the shortening of global commodity chains, as shown with the risks of being exposed to the Chinese economy, can have both environmental benefits and also have a security benefits as well. Now, an institutional framework which allows the most powerful states, namely the United States, to pursue relative gains rather than earlier attempts to structure international climate regimes around principles such as combat differentiated responsibilities, obviously has some global justice implications. If you're setting a regime up which allows the powerful to maintain power or become more powerful, that might be a problem. But it's the only way you get the United States into the tent, or get the European Union into the tent, or China for that matter, then therefore realists would argue that is the least worst alternative if global emissions come down. Realists, of course, aren't devoid of a theory of justice, and one of their most powerful theories of justice, which is often not fully worked through, is a theory of intergenerational justice. It makes no sense from a realist perspective, or any perspective really, to try and maintain the power, prestige, or even the survival of the nation state if you're not doing that for future generations as well. So actually realism provides a more, I think, compelling account of intergenerational justice than does neoliberal institutionalism, which is more concerned with short-term absolute gains. So all of this gives realism at some level the capacity to begin to deal with intergenerational problems and also problems of biospheric management. And in doing so is perhaps more attuned to the complexity and the entanglement of human and non-human systems within the Anthropocene. Neorealism, unfortunately, doesn't have that potential, though, and there are two logics within neorealism that I think reduce its scope for reflecting an Anthropocene politics. One's derived from the, so I'm jumping around the logic of balancing. So, of course, the whole notion of balance of power is all about stability rather than managing changing equilibriums. And, of course, hegemonic stability theory, the logic of domination, is all about stabilising the system through one dominant or one group of dominant states as well. What neoclassical realism does, in a way in which neorealism and even classical realism doesn't, is actually has some interesting ontological and epistemological connections with resilience thinking, which in turn connects with unpredictability and indeed the unknowability of geopolitics in the Anthropocene, where you've got these uncontrollable interactions between human systems and biogeochemical systems. Now, going back to Rose's classic formulation from the 1990s of neoclassical realism, where it accepts the classical realist injunction that the scope and ambition of a country's foreign policy is driven first and foremost by its place in the system and specifically by its relative power capabilities. But neoclassical realists reject the more the classical formulation, and that they say the impact of power capabilities on foreign policy is indirect and complex because systemic pressures must be translated through domestic variables. What that then allows neoclassical realists to do is actually, rather than seeing a determinate system of anarchy or indeed a system that balances out in the Waltzian or the neorealist view, they actually see the system of international anarchy as neither Hobbesian nor benign, but rather murky and difficult to read. So the neoclassical realist view or understanding of the international system is beginning to approximate a reading of the Anthropocene based on unknowability, uncontrollability, unpredictability, and so on and so forth. So to render this understanding of the geopolitical world as complex and unstable and beyond the comprehension and control of policymakers, I think neoclassical realist thought converges most with resilience thinking and therefore converges more with, if we can say there's some sort of reality to the Anthropocene condition, then something that sort of relates or reflects that understanding more so than views of an international system that can or should be stabilised. So just as resilience thinking seeks to accommodate that heightened complexity, uncertainty, and the risk of systemic perturbation within a framework built around notions of responsibility, adaptiveness, inventiveness, and flexibility. And those kind of notions also appeal to the more humbler form of neoclassical realist thought. Now, of course, there's not necessarily no order in all of this. For neoclassical realists, they emphasise prudence and pragmatism in foreign policy and the necessity of living with complexity, but they do see some order to this complexity, and that is some form of anarchy, even if it's not as determinate as neo-realists would claim. Whilst for theorists of resilience, the order in the system actually derives from self-governing properties of sociological systems, even if these can't be known. Both perspectives, however, do stress the contingency of world events and are highly sceptical of the claims of political rationality or linear logics of history, which you see in liberal accounts, and especially any attempts by institutionalists to regulate international politics. And I think that's why you see in the Paris Agreement a much less than ideal regime developed a set of governance properties from a liberal institutionalist perspective. But from the realist perspective, you actually see something that might have the potential to work, not in a perfect way, but at least to reduce emissions from where they would be in the absence of that agreement. So I might leave it there, I think.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. That was terrific. And thank you to all three presenters for being so timely with delivering their presentation. So we now have 20 minutes for Q&A, and obviously we'll have questions from both Burwood and on Zoom. So please stick up your hand and we'll try to make sure that you get the chance. Nothing Oh, do we have any questions? Was that a, no questions? Okay. I've got a bunch of questions if no one's prepared to jump the gun. I suppose my first question would be for Umut. You left us with this really intriguing question about effective practices in the transformation of borders. And I was wondering if I could just ask you to elaborate on that. From where I stand at the moment, you know, I think the networked border analogy that you present is really compelling. And I was just wondering, though, how could that possibly be unraveled? I mean, all the logics of our economy, society, politics seem to be configured towards tightening or maintaining this. And I sort of think of both sides of politics in Australia and their positions on borders. And I wonder what sort of dynamic in the Australian context in particular could lead to a transformation, or is this basically a description of another country?
Well, thank you, Zim. It's a very difficult question to answer, I believe. In the Australian context, the borders have always been very problematic because I think it's because of its imagination of itself as an island, which kind of brings your question as well, and this very strong distinction between island, the land and sea in the constitution of Australian borders, and how that distinction of land and sea kind of legitimizes Australian borders and its colonization of the borders. So Australia has always been a difficult case to deal with. In terms of network borders, that's a good idea. And I think the contemporary borders work in a network fashion. But if, as an analytical tool, we kind of think borders in the context of networks, then we kind of accept some established parameters. Like when I think of networks, I think that there are dots in the network that are connected to each other. So we kind of take some dots as given or is already there. Whereas my understanding of effective politics or borders as effective practices, I think begins with the idea that we should not take anything as given. And we should more focus on the floating notions or floating elements of the borders and bodies. And if we take effect as a starting point, it means that when bodies encounter with each other, and by bodies, I do not simply mean humans and non-human bodies, when they encounter with each other, the possibilities are endless. So yes, I agree that the modern state is actually another word for biopolitics, and it's really difficult to challenge this normalized notion of biopolitics. As we also see during the COVID, right? We closed the borders and we kind of normalize the closing of the borders because we think that that's the only way to protect ourselves. And we didn't think of what we left outside the borders. It was a kind of a non-questioned area. And interestingly, in Australia, the closed borders were supported by left wing and kind of were challenged by liberals, interestingly. But the question is, we take some of the biopolitical elements very, very normalized, and I think that's a bit problematic, and that's why I like to think borders by going beyond that notion of biopolitics. And again, Australia is a very difficult example. In the context of Australia, I think the things start with kind of challenging the settler colonial borders. So we need to go to the rabbit hole a bit to change things, I believe.
Thank you, Umut. That's very helpful.
Thank you for the question.
Steve.
So I've got a sort of a question. I'm trying to think about these papers in conjunction and the way they intersect. And I guess, you know, stability, some kind of order is what's sort of animating a concern amongst all these papers. And I guess the question I also wanted to insert into this is there a common solution to these different kinds of problems, whether it's thinking about Schmidt or thinking about borders or thinking about neoclassical realism? And the answer being some conception of engaging with the question of world government. This idea of a government, because there are some neoclassical realism that do speak to this idea of world government, for example. And of course, some kind of world government could be a solution to the idea of the problems of borders. I'm not sure about Schmidt. I'll leave that to Miguel. But I guess the idea of a world government, of course, in conventional political parlance is insane. But thinking about these papers, I think the idea of dividing the world up amongst 190 militarized autonomous states is also insane. So I asked the question basically, is world government a solution to these different conceptions of critiques of geopolitics?
Big question, Steve. Thank you. Maybe we take that in turn. Each of you give a short response.
I was just going to say no for pragmatic reasons.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Schmidt obviously thought a lot about world government, and he gives different options. And one of them is, he says, world government would be possible if everyone would accept to be governed ultimately by a technology and also technological mindset, right? But he interestingly thought that would be possible only not on Earth, but in a as it were parallel world, which is pretty much he saw the metaverse there. That is a sense of, in a completely digital reality, then you could have a one world algorithmically governed, so to speak. But otherwise, he says the polarities are inevitable, and that's where he comes up with his idea of great spaces. That, I mean, it's yet again Schmidt, right? First, the state of exception. We know all about that. Yet again, he seems to have anticipated 50 years ahead the situation in which international relations find ourselves right now. So it's, yeah.
I mean, it depends what you mean by world government. Does it mean the end of the sovereign state? And I think that's, this is a debate that's been going on in environmental international theory for 30 or 40 years. And I think the pragmatists have probably won and said, well, the state's not going anywhere yet. But the notion of sovereignty is certainly something that is changing constantly and has changed constantly. And that neoclassical realists can certainly accommodate changing notions of sovereignty. Even classical realists can, maybe neo realists can't. So I guess if I was to push the Paris Agreement analogy, and I'm careful of not pushing it too far, but it is demonstrating a different form of global governance that actually speaks to both the necessity to actually have an effective regime of controlling what we're doing to the biosphere to a point, not an ideal regime, which can never be ideal, but also in a way which doesn't demand huge changes to the way in which we conceive sovereignty. It demands some changes, but not huge changes.
Thanks, respondents. We'll go to Ben next and then Bauke.
Thanks, guys. What a fantastic panel, and really great papers, thought-provoking and interesting and really provocative and really well presented. So thank you, wonderful colleagues and wonderful work. So I was just thinking about the sort of framing of all of this around new planetary perspectives on geopolitics, which is the kind of framing that's been given for these papers. But I wonder if any of you sort of are reflecting on the new parochialism or the new tribalism or the new localism that seems to be infecting a lot of global politics. So you might argue that, really at the moment, what we're seeing is a withdrawal of globalization and an increase in kind of more localized perspectives and sort of more concern about how local issues are governed at a local level. And certainly this plays out in a number of different ways, particularly in far right anti-immigration discourse or sort of Trump type discourse that we've seen over recent years, Brexit and so on. but also can play out just in completely completely the opposite kind of pro-democratic, pro kind of liberal attitudes of nurturing the local first and worrying about the global second, because the global seems too hard and too difficult and too far away to solve. So I just wonder about, while this is really provocative and interesting, this new planetary perspective, you know, to what extent is there a new planetary perspective, and how does that clash against kind of the increasing momentum, I would say, behind sort of localized, parochial, tribal, isolationist kind of politics that we see as well? Thanks.
Maybe we just take those in order again. Thanks, Ben, for the question.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, if you take the Chakrabarty model that you have the planetary as opposed to globalization, then I think you're right that the planetary can go in a very localized sense, right? In the sense that it's critiquing this kind of global mobility and therefore it's different ways of thinking rootedness to the earth again, you know. So there's an emphasis on this dimension of rootedness to where you are and taking care of everything around where you are, so to speak. So I think you're right, but at the same time, right, the planetary opens up to a kind of higher level of universalism even than globalization. So yeah, I think there are these both aspects, but we haven't yet learned how to articulate it. It's in many ways parallel to the way in which indigenous struggles and claims for recognition and knowledges operate both at a very localized, but also at a hyper international institutional level, right? There's a similar paradox there.
Thank you, Ben. This is a really interesting question, and I really agree with your points of how things could get so paradoxical. One thing perhaps in our understanding of globalization or the global, the way in which we understand global has never been global. So we insist that there has been a globalization. I disagree with that. I think the globalization has worked for only for few, but excluding others. My understanding of planetary, therefore, is all about reading ethics in different ways and reading how the idea of human has been constructed in a very anthropocentric ways. So rather than when we talk about planetary politics, rather than talking about first institutions and governance and democracy and liberalism and far right, we first need to go, I think, to understand how we produce this knowledge that brought us to this point, and how we constructed the human in a very specific way, that particular construction of human has become so violent and destructive. So I don't think planetary, therefore, is something for or against global or local. I think maybe, like Schmidt said, it just operates at another level, another dimension. It's like kind of a different level of thinking, I believe, rather than operating with these already existing politics. That's my personal opinion.
I think the notion of isolationism is interesting, and it's quite problematic in the sense that there really, with the exception of North Korea, no isolationist powers. And I think to describe what's happened with Trump in America as being the expression of isolationism is really not right. I mean, America's never been isolationist. It goes through patches of Jeffersonian thought, which is very much about perfecting the revolution at home and being very wary of external entanglements, but it would never say it's isolationist. I think that's what Trump was really fundamentally a Jeffersonian in that respect. He was the first US president in a long while not to start a war, and he very nearly ended one or two as well. So isolation is obviously impossible in the world we live in, as it always has been. But to think that that's actually a political dynamic, nationalism, sure, parochialism, all of these kind of things. But what I think realism, and particularly neoclassical realism, helps us do is actually make sense of what we might call isolationist tendencies, and certainly make sense of being wary of international entanglements, and being wary of going in too deep, and being, I guess, wary of just simply not possessing enough knowledge to know how things are going to turn out, and therefore to act in a very prudent and restrained way. And again, I'm not terribly fond of Trump, but in some respects he was quite coherent on all of that. Not in what he said, but in what he did. So just don't confuse that as isolationism, I think, is probably my argument.
Thanks for those responses to an interesting question. Baogang, over to you.
Thank you, Zance. I have a question for Mingos. You're talking about Carl Schmitt. And so my question about Carl Schmitt, he's talking about this land power, sea power, and point out the possibility of a great bird, air power. So all the way he discussed is still beyond, still limited to the geopolitical consideration in there. To what extent Carl Schmitt, his idea can offer us a way to go beyond geopolitics and to understand this kind of new planetary order. So I'm concerned with to what extent Carl Schmitt is kind of still useful for us to think about the planetary order. And following this question, I wanted to just look at the, under this geopolitical framework, how geopolitics can promote planetary order. So currently the current geopolitics really they are more concerned with a power competition rather than the global concern, global issue. But how does this geopolitics can actually help us lead to go to another new level of planetary order? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think the way I would say that the most interesting aspect of Schmitt is this idea that politics depends on the kind of element, planetary element, in which a people or peoples decide to live in. So all the questions that Peter raised, which are really interesting from a neo-realist perspective, having to do either with the survival, the resilience, and or the stability of any system, I think Schmitt would answer, yes, that's all true, but under what element are you talking about the resilience, stability, and survival of your system or the state? Because that will depend whether the state understands itself or a people understands itself as living a life on the sea or in the element of water, as opposed to a terrestrial life. For Schmitt, terrestrial powers is not that they did not advance technology or did not use technology. It's just that they used it in a very different sense because it was always limited, so to speak, by the law of the earth, as opposed to the unlimitedness that you require vis-a-vis technology when you're at sea. Now, I think the other interesting point that he says is that both land-based and sea-based law of the earth have come to an end. So there's a sense in which we are, according to him, if we think in terms of land and sea still today, we're applying old answers to new questions. He himself he did not know what the answer to the question that the Anthropocene is posing to us is. He admits it, but he just says, we are being posed a different question than the one that was posed in the Renaissance and that started modernity. We're in a different place, but he didn't have an answer to that. But it has to do something with the elements that we choose to live in. And so to choose, for example, to live in the aerial element does not mean to build more planes or think of your country as a kind of aircraft carrier or something like that, because that is still an old paradigm.
So how would he deal with the complex systems that we have now? You've got biological systems, human-made systems, technological systems, all of those kind. I mean, that'd be another element in addition to the air.
Yeah, I think he associated the element of fire with the atomic age, right? Yeah. For sure. And the ether, the air, that is an interesting one because, as I said, to me it connotes more, something like the internet would be a system that is, in a sense, more in the ether, right?
Yes.
Neither sea nor land, and so you need different logics. But he didn't have a system for this. These were thoughts of an old man, and he just didn't like NATO, that's for sure. But that is terribly tragic because now the powers that are seeking to undo, let's say, the National Atlantic International Order, they draw from Schmidt. Their ideology is pretty clear that this is what's happening.
Okay, that takes us to time. Riveting end to a fantastic discussion. Thank you to Miguel, Umut, and Peter for their really stimulating papers. Thank you to all of you for joining the discussion, particularly for those who posed questions. And we'll end it there. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.